All right, we got a few coming in now. So Jacob is basically just saying, I'm wondering if you could go over some mid-side EQ examples or reasons that you might even use mid-side EQ. So it's a great question. Mid-side EQ is it's probably like a somewhat like underrated thing. I think like initially like no one really talks about it, and then you get into the production world and you're like, oh, this is actually like a very commonly used technique. So I don't know if Pete or Zach, either one of you want to start off with this question. I have like five examples on the top of my head, so I'm sure I'll end up adding to this, but I'm trying not to talk that much. So
Yeah. Zach,
Pete,
you want to kick us off since you're screen?
sure, yeah. I think mid-side EQ for me, I actually have started to use it a lot more than I when I use I you know and over the last maybe 6 to 8 months, I've just started to use it way more. And I think it's because I started to realize that pretty much every sound that you place into a mix or that you start with is like either a very stereo sound or something that is occupying the sides pretty heavily or not. Like very rarely will like a sound out of Serum or a sound from a sample pack, at least what I've find, be like kind of in the middle where just as much important information is in the mids as on the sides. And I think that just comes from like listening to a ton of stuff and kind of analyzing it and using mid-side EQ. But for me, I really think like as a mixing tool, I use mid-side like to separate whenever I'm layering like two sounds to make clear the middle. It's usually the mid-range that gets kind of bulky and distorted and like overlaps a lot. So having a sound that's primarily on the sides and really forcing it to be on the sides, that's kind of where I use it the most. So like removing a bunch of mid-range. So for instance, like, if I have a mid-side EQ, like right here, just taking, that middle out of a sound completely, like in this kind of mid-range, in order to have another sound, a layer that is dominantly middle in that range come through, as well as like the same thing on the sides, right? Like if a sound is a mid sound and there's not a lot of side information, maybe you can take out like, the top end of it. So I guess for me, it's just like overall, like it's just a great way to help make layers sound smoother together and just cleaner, without doing too much damage to the frequency content, without making the sound feel like it's filtered. It's just a great way to kind of force sounds into either the mid category or the side category, but without showing like a specific example. I don't think in this song I have like a specific example. I could probably try to like come up with one, but
I could probably add to just like, I'm assuming this is a use case that happens in almost every single song. And it's just like using mid-side is a great way to essentially tighten up the low end of whatever it is that you're working on.
To like 2000 or so. And I don't, I think one of you guys might have just been, okay, cool. I'm sorry, I'm just hearing myself on the end of someone's
yeah,
but yeah, so basically like, I mean, I was mixing this track and from like 1500 hertz up to 2000 hertz or so. Down the middle is just super cluttered. And so what I did is I just like used mid-side to carve out that range in the mids so the vocal could sit there. And I still had that body and the instruments out on the sides. And so therefore like, still kept like the body of the instruments, but the actual like two different elements in the song were fitting together better.
I'm back. My internet just like completely went out and reconnected, so I just like it dropped me from the meeting.
Yep, no worries.
Welcome back. Yeah, no worries. So last thing about mid-side EQ before we go on to the next question, those examples that Pete gave in like the mastering situation, like that's a perfect use case of mid-side EQ, like doing something very macro, very global on the entire track. But you can do that essentially on every single layer of your song. Like you almost have to think about mid-side EQ as this new world of possibility of like just what it is that you can tamper with or what you can manipulate to make room for other things. So where you were once maybe in your head limited to you have a frequency at 5,000 hertz, for example, and you want to make room for some other vocal to kind of live right in that space, you don't have to limit yourself to doing a cut or a boost at 5,000 hertz on both the left and right side or the entire sound of the track. You can actually go in and hone in on just the mids versus just the sides. And it's, to me, the biggest thing about mid-side EQ is just that reality, the fact that you have that capability to be able to do that. And then once you're aware of that, that means that every time you ever access a song or a layer of your song, you have the potential to make room for a layer or a sound in a completely different way. So again, for me, mid-side is mostly just about like the additional malleability that it presents itself, as opposed to any sort of like crazy tricks or any, you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of cool things you can do with it, but for me, it's just like, oh, I can really hone in on exactly what I want to deal with that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry if I'm butchering this name. Gwilym. My bad if I'm messing that up. Is basically asking any tips on how you can tell when compression does more harm than good. What's your methodology to differentiate sounds that need compression and those that don't? I'll let Pete and Zach like go off on this in a second, but to me, the biggest thing about whether or not a sound needs compression is like, yes, you can use your ears to figure this out, but for me, it's automatically much more obvious than if you just separate something that's organic, like an actual performance, right? So maybe a guitar lick or a saxophone player or a bongo player or a vocalist, right? Anything that's recorded, anything that's live versus anything that's synthetic and kind of programmed in, right? So samples, using MIDI, just, using like VSTs and all those synths that you have access to. Right away, there's this huge difference of the dynamic range of recorded and digital stuff versus human and organic stuff. So right off the bat, I would just say that you 9.9 times out of 10 do not need to compress the stuff that is completely digital. It's already been recorded once, and by, like, you actually want to insert the opposite of compression to the digital things. You want to make it move more and bounce more and jump more, whereas the organic stuff is the stuff that you want to quell that dynamic range. You want the performances to feel tighter and better. So right off the bat, I think that's like kind of for me at least, my main methodology about like whether or not I even want to compress something.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I think like one really good way just to like double check that you actually do like the sound of a compressor is using your makeup gain feature. So pretty much like in any compressor, you'll have like the opportunity to, you can do whatever compression you want, and then there will be like a makeup gain. So you can see, okay, if I'm getting like 4 dBs gain reduction, dial back in 4 dBs of makeup gain, and then just like flip your compressor on and off to see like, am I actually getting a desirable sound out of this compressor? And I know it's a bit subjective just because you still need to like use your ears to see if, you like the sound and if it's actually improving. But I think like that's just one good way to not get fooled per se by like an increase in volume that's coming, or a decrease in volume that might be coming from a compressor or from like a tone that you're getting from a compressor or something. Like using the makeup gain is to be able to, you can use it to say like at the exact same volume, is this sound better or worse with the compressor? And so I think like that's just one way to, at least help you identify like maybe cases where you don't need to compress, because if you do at that point, it's like, oh, this actually doesn't sound as good with the compressor, then that should hopefully help answer your question that, maybe you don't need to compress that sound.
Yeah, totally. And honestly, if it's something you struggle with initially, what I would really recommend is to just avoid compression kind of altogether on digital synthetic based sounds. Just don't even pull it out for a little bit. And then maybe over time, you'll start to develop a little sense of just like when you might want to reach for it. And it's usually more of like for me at least, I like to use it in like a glue scenario where you're just taking a bunch of different sounds and kind of gluing them together, which is like a very common, compression technique, which I'm pretty sure all three of us do in the Mixmaster Flow course several times.
Mm-hmm. And just to make sure we're clear, like definitely, like I think sidechain compression is totally cool with the digital sounds, but just like actual like traditional compression is probably something you might want to avoid, at least at first. We actually just wrote a really great blog article, all like dedicated to compression and actually helping answer some of these questions. I can link it in the chat as well.
Yeah, throw that in the chat for sure.
Cool.
I can add a little bit, even though you guys went back and forth and really nailed that one. For me, like, I would just say also to be aware, specifically with mastering when you're using compression, to not have a pumping effect. So a really common thing to hear if you over compress or over limit really a master is you hear like a pumping nature, so it feels like the sound is kind of going in and out of intensity. So that's a way you'll know it's too much. But like Pete and Sarek both mentioned, I mean, compression's one of those things where, you know, little bits of it honestly are okay to do even on a digital sound. Like, I'm talking like really small amounts, because at that point you're almost like using compressors for their tonality and like almost like a saturation type effect to kind of like thicken up a sound, not so much like actually changing the dynamics like you would with an acoustic instrument or something where you're like doing like 7 to 15 dBs of gain reduction. That kind of compression is just not needed on digital sounds. But I mean, for me at least, you can see in my videos, I use a ton of multiband compression on like synth sounds to just kind of fatten them up a little more and decrease the dynamic range ever so slightly. But I kind of think of that more as like it's almost like salt and pepper to the mix. Like, it's, you can just put a little bit here and there on sounds to help glue them in groups or individual sounds to flatten out the spectrum and shift the tonal balance with like a multiband. But yeah, you don't want to be overdoing compression when you don't need it. But at the same time, like, it is a very valuable tool at making like loud and clean sounding music. So definitely check out that article too. That like further explains everything.
Cool. Eric's got a question here about levels. When you start producing, do you try to get your levels on point before the mix down? Where do you want them sitting during production?
So are you saying like levels on, you mean like just the volume of each instrument while you're creating the song? Is that like...
That's what I would assume, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I personally try as quickly as possible in the creation process to basically set my levels right. Like, I don't really make a song and just totally ignore the volume of instruments. It just, like, when I'm composing, it just doesn't work for me that way. Like, I have to make some sort of conscious decision, like, is this the right balance of these instruments while I'm picking out sounds and writing melodies and stuff, because that is such an important factor as to whether something is sounding like good or bad, is the levels. So you'll get better over time for sure. And anchoring your kick drum is like a great way to start this out when your ears are still not fully developed, to being able to pick out the subtle differences in volume changes. But, you know, I would say starting off as soon as possible, getting your balance correct. And you can always make subtle changes later, and when you have a mix down, you know, like add some volume. But I find that like the sooner you do it, it's just better overall, because it saves time and also changes your decision making when it comes to like adding another sound and stuff like that.
Yeah, just a few really, really quick tips surrounding levels and gain structure and stuff like that. So Zach quickly mentioned anchoring your kick drum. So what I like to do for a really long time is set my kick drum at the beginning of the production process, and then once I've set it, I literally do not touch it again. So if I set my kick at -8, for example, and by the way, normally it's between -6 and -10 as like a general rule of thumb. It's somewhere in there. You could go a little quieter if you're still struggling to maintain like headroom within that range. But let's just say for the example here, set your kick drum at -8. That means that if you want your kick drum to get louder, you don't ever change the volume of the kick again. You're actually going to just lower all the other layers of your track. And what this will force you to do is work within the constraints of what setting your kick drum at -8 means. Like, if you're at -8 and you're clipping, that most likely means that maybe you have too much brightness in some of your synths and you need to actually taper it down with some EQ. Or maybe your volumes aren't kind of correct, or maybe your balances are way off. Giving yourself some healthy kind of constraints like this kind of, at least for me, for a long time, helped me kind of work within a much more manageable balance and flow that I just wasn't aware of until I started to force myself to do that. So start by anchoring your kick drum. Again, if you want to raise something, it means lowering other things as opposed to raising the thing in question. And obviously, if you're seeing anything that's in the red collectively across all the channels combined, then you could be clipping. And even then, if you're clipping a little, I mean, you want to avoid that as much as possible. But if you're not audibly hearing clipping, even then, it's kind of potentially okay. I don't want to walk down this whole path of like distortion and clipping and all that because it's just going to open up a can of worms. But use your ears more than you're using the level, like the metering tools in front of you.
Yeah. And actually, just to add on one final thought there, I think like this is also one of the huge values in like printing everything to audio. And when you actually do go to do your mix down, starting with like, what we actually started with in the course where it's just audio stems. For me, then, when you're actually producing, I always have like this internal conversation of things that like, they're not great, but like I'll fix it in mixing. And so like with your gain staging, for me, then when I'm producing, it's just like, as long as the gain staging is like okay to the point where it's not like negatively affecting my production process, even though I know it's not perfect, like I just don't really worry about it as much. And once I actually print things to audio and go to mix, then that's where I focus on, setting my kick drum at a right level and then being really intentional with where I'm setting the volumes of all of these other sounds. But for the actual production process, for me, it's just as long as it's not like terrible, as long as it's like fine, then it's okay to continue on.
Yeah, awesome. So there's actually a few questions in the chat kind of surrounding a similar theme of just like gain structure, levels, metering, things like that. So we'll go through, I think there's at least two of them. So we'll kind of go into these real quick. Warren's asking tips for managing levels pre/during mixing. I've been having some issues in Ableton with mixing too hot. And if you choose all the tracks to turn down globally, it cancels all of the automation. The only solution I've found is to manage levels with a utility on each track.
Yeah, so are you saying like you have are you automating the actual faders in Ableton, and that's why? Because you shouldn't, that's like one of the main reasons why I never automate the faders, because if I do any volume automation, I do it with like a gain on a utility on each individual track, and that's specifically so I'm able to globally lower or raise stuff. So that might solve that problem.
Yeah, and that's the same thing in Logic too. Like you can't globally change automation using the volume faders. Like this is something that I was super frustrated with, I think in like 2009 or something. Like when I first started production, I couldn't understand why the hell this was even an issue. And the answer is you're already doing the answer, which by suggesting that to use a utility on each track. But now you just need to incorporate that somehow into your like dedicated workflow. And it could be as simple as like, you can set Ableton or you can set Logic to open a new track every time it opens. It could have that utility just on it already.
And that's exactly what I do. Every one of my new default tracks has the utility on it, and that's the only thing on each track. So that's because I always do automation with volume, and so that's an important thing to try to do.
Yeah, because automation with volume is the most underrated thing in mixing. Like it's super important. It's not something you should avoid doing just because of these like difficulties. Like you have to find a way to incorporate this into your workflow because volume automation is something you should be reaching for early and often for sure.
Yeah.
Also, Sarek, I don't know if your mic is like doing that buzzy thing when you're speaking. I don't know if you can fix that while we're.
Let me just hold on. Better?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Hear like a weird like whistle.
Yeah, there's like a feedback, like high pitch thing.
Yeah, I'm actually hearing that.
Now it's gone.
Yeah.
I think that was me. That was like coming from somewhere else. But anyway, there was one other question about metering that I wanted. Actually, several questions about metering. We don't have to stay on metering for too long, but let's do one more from Philippe. What up, dude? Do you still aim for EDM levels of loudness, even if planning to release on Spotify, where it just gets normalized to -12 dB LUFS? Would you ever recommend doing two masters, one loud for SoundCloud and one at -12 for streaming.
So I can actually jump on this one. So for me, and I'm actually curious to get your guys' thoughts as well. Like, I definitely care a lot less about loudness now than I did like 2 years ago. I still think there's a lot of value in getting your master up to something that is at least like comparable with your reference tracks. Like for me, it's usually like, you know, if I'm hitting it somewhere between like -7 and -8 LUFS, like I'm totally happy and like pretty much don't have much of a concern for loudness at that point. In regards to the two masters though, I will sometimes make two masters, like one not specifically for SoundCloud, but I'll do like one for all streaming services, and then I'll make one to like play out live, like in a club, just because at that point, like the loudness still does matter if someone actually has like the MP3. I don't like worry too much about getting that second master up on like Beatport or whatever, but like for me, like when I'm actually playing like my own stuff in a club, will sometimes add like a little bit extra loudness in. But yeah, I mean, I think like in regards to the streaming services, like I think it's a lot more important now to like just get a better sounding master and preserve a great sounding mix rather than potentially sacrificing a little bit of both of those to get a little bit of extra loudness.
Yeah, because if you're in a consistent creative flow of making music, it's not like you can just all of a sudden, at least I don't think so, like take a track that you've been working on, you know, you've been working on the mix, and you've been doing this across multiple songs, and you usually end up somewhere between like -7, -8, -9 LUFS. Like you can't just like lower that same track to -12 and be like, oh, I'm done, because like your entire limiting and everything kind of that's affecting the track like has now changed, and you could actually be removing some of the emotional kind of impact or the emotional quality of the song by doing that. Like it's not just a quick and easy change. It's something that I think has to be worked in kind of appropriately with all the other things going on. So like I would avoid, basically, long story short, I would avoid just doing that like quick like -12 master and think that that's like going to be better. What I would shoot for is exactly what Pete is saying, is a healthy master in that like no louder than like -6. Probably even that's super loud, but like -7, -8 range. If you can get a healthy, clean, beautiful sounding master in that range, it doesn't matter if Spotify turns it down a little bit more. It's still going to sound great. But what you don't want to do is you turn it down too much so that when they do normalize it there, it's lost some of its kind of like, you know, like EDM glue or kind of consistent bass presence or whatever it is that you've achieved through your general mastering and mixing process.
Yeah, I have a couple things I want to add to this, because my entire like philosophy, as well as just sort of the way I do my own music right now, has kind of started to change in this realm. Like, I do agree with everything that's been said in terms of like it's not necessary nowadays to have the loudest music for it to do well. In fact, like some of the music that's doing the best in the electronic world, like Martin Garrix and stuff like that, is not that loud. Like his masters aren't loud, but there is something to be said for like what kind of Sarek mentioned towards the end there, that like EDM sound, the glue. There is a sonic difference between a song that is limited and mastered at a very loud EDM way and then brought down by Spotify versus a song that's mastered in a more subtle way and not brought down as much by Spotify. And you'll notice it, especially when you cross over to like something like SoundCloud or something like that, because they don't lower the gain. So for one thing, if you're still releasing music on SoundCloud, you still have to compete with the loudness wars. Like there's just no working around it. Like all the biggest artists' music on SoundCloud is still extremely loud and full, and you will think your song doesn't sound as good playing it back to back. You know, there's something to be said for some people don't care, and you know, it's not like this isn't like a hard like line, but I will say that what I pretty much master loud and then let Spotify turn it down, because I still find that Spotify turning it down, the way it's perceived just sounds better to me in fullness and clarity and like a master than me purposely not limiting as hard and like keeping the track more dynamic. I just find that when I get it to Spotify and listen to those versions, they don't sound as good if I don't actually do a healthy EDM master to begin with. And I don't know, it all depends on the metering plugin you use as well. Like I don't think about like a certain number. All I can tell you is that my meter that I use is the WLM meter by Waves, which I believe Sarek has and Pete has. I'm not sure if you guys use that meter as your meter, but that meter, most of my masters currently are hitting at about like -6 LUFS. That's usually where I get it comfortably loud and full, and it competes with all my references. But I've also gotten ones that reference tracks that go all the way down to like -4 on this meter, or like -4.5. So I'm usually somewhere in the range of like -5 to -6.5 on this meter right here in the long-term LUFS readout in the middle. So that's what I would shoot for if I were you, personally, if you're making electronic music.
Yeah, and inside of that, like that is a pretty important thing. Like it doesn't matter what metering plugin you use as long as you stay consistent with one of them, because they all kind of read volume in like a slightly different way. Like if you're using the, the span metering tool, that one has like a completely different output reading than the WLM meter or the like any other meters for that matter. So just whatever you pick, stick with that one and don't try to like jump around. Just kind of keep like, get comfortable with whatever one feels best to you. And as far as just like this workshop or this like Q&A workshop that we're running right now. So basically everyone's putting in questions into the Q&A. If you want to like comment on some of the things that we're currently talking about, right? Like that wouldn't make sense for us to come back to like in 20 minutes or in 45 minutes or something, like feel free to still use the chat, to like add a comment or add a tiny little question or whatever it is in the chat. That way, like we can kind of go a little bit more back and forth as opposed to just like us like trying our best to answer the question. Cause sometimes there's like, secondary questions that this opens up to, and I want you guys to kind of feel free to at least, interact a little bit with us. So Rob is basically saying, and on that note, is the Pro L2 meter fine?
Yeah, so, like Sarah just said, the meter the meter is irrelevant. It's just making sure that you're consistently checking your reference against the same meter. You wouldn't want to like figure out what the reading is using the WLM meter on your reference track and then read your L2 meter as your loudness. You would want to make sure to use the same one. That's all that matters.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Let's maybe take a little break from levels and metering. Maybe talk about something else. A lot of questions here. Let me just pick a good one. We'll get to all of them, I think, but let's do. Oh, we can talk a little bit about ear training. So, best platform for ear training. I heard about Golden Ears and Sound Gym. Would you recommend those or any apps, sites in the same vein? Is ear training something you implement in your routine? So I'll just start with this one by saying that I have used Sound Gym in the past. Sound Gym is really cool. Like it's basically like a video game that actually kind of benefits your ears a little bit. Like it really is kind of addictive. Like you get to like just play with sounds and guess their frequencies or kind of like figure out important musical information about audio in front of you through like a gamification system. So is it 100% necessary? I mean, I was making music for 7 or 8 years before I even heard about these kind of training apps, these ear training apps. So I'm not convinced that these are like make or break or anything like that, but does it help? Like, absolutely. Like the more that I was doing that, the more that I was kind of just like audibly able to identify certain little things. And I think that, ear training or ear development is something that does take quite a long time, I think, to kind of get good at. So if an ear training tool can kind of help you with that I don't want to call it a learning curve, but I guess it is. It's a learning curve. It just takes a lot of time to kind of fully understand audio and kind of train your ears to identify what a dope sound even is. Like, what does that even mean? So something like Sound Gym can definitely help, but I don't think it's like a necessary thing by any means. All right, another question here. Let's find a good one. So Jacob's asking, what's your all's biggest go-tos to make sounds bigger, like the Haas effect or inflator? There's like so many things we can talk about here. Pete, you want to start with maybe one or two or something?
Yeah, so I think even just like the way that that question got asked is kind of indicative of the answer, is that like there are tons of different ways, and I think like being comfortable with how you can achieve loudness and in different ways, it kind of it helps inform your process a little bit, because like certain techniques will work best on different sounds. So I mean, at least for me, probably my first go-to is just with saturation and distortion. I mean, you can just get perceived loudness by correctly using a bunch of those plugins. So I know like we probably beat the Decapitator to death throughout the course of Mixmaster Flow, but like that's a personal favorite for me. I really like the Sound Toys Devilock Deluxe, which is like it kind of does like a little bit of everything, but that is almost, I kind of use it as like a parallel processing thing, and so you can get this sort of like compression and crunchy distortion, and then mixing it back in parallel with the dry signal. Like that is a really good way to get some additional loudness as well. I mean, things like the Haas effect for like some perceptual loudness, or just like, you know, sometimes getting extra width on sounds. Like I've gotten into it actually a lot in like the last few weeks, but there's this cool plugin from Waves called the S1. It's just like a stereo imager, but it does a really good job of like getting extra width without inducing any phase cancellation. So that's another way to get some like perceptual loudness just by like messing with the width here. But yeah, I mean, like you know, kind of like how you asked, and what I guess I'm trying to get at is that there are a bunch of different ways. And so I think like, you know, if you are looking to get, you know, more perceived loudness on an individual sound, you know, having that toolkit of, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 different ways that you're really comfortable with, and then saying, okay, let me try, you know, option 1, and don't really like how it came out, let me try option 2, let me try option 3. I think you do that enough, and then you kind of just start to learn that like, oh, for this kind of sound, I'm going to use the Decapitator, or for this kind of sound, I just need a little bit more width, or like whatever. But there's, you know, there's probably a dozen other like strategies we can talk about. But yeah.
Yeah, I almost want to, like, it's almost like you can bucket in all of your plugin based effects, right? There's a lot of different plugins that create largeness in a sense. One strategy that I think every single person is aware of, but to me is the number one tool for making things bigger, is just the concept of layering. Because inside of layering, there's so many things you can do, including the use of all the different plugins, right? But if you have a sound, for example, that's super wide, a lot of this has to do with kind of like duality or opposites in a way. Like if something is really wide, what do you really think would make that one sound a lot bigger? Off the top of my head, I would think that introducing a mono sound into that super wide sound could actually beefing it up in a way that, you know, we could never achieve through that original source sound to begin with. So kind of layering for opposites in a way, right? So that's one example, like a super wide sound, layering it with a really mono sound. Another example might be what you can achieve through layering in terms of like using different octaves or even different composition. Like sometimes harmonies sound just really huge, whereas, you know, the same notes don't. Or maybe the octave or 2 octaves worth of the same sound in a different texture or something makes it sound huge. So between saturation and plugins and amps and all that stuff and layering, I would think that you have an endless combinations of ways to make things bigger. And then if all of those things for some reason ever fail you, just reach for the inflator and it does it with, you know, the turn of one knob, or maybe not the turn, I guess the fade of one knob, but yeah, you can.
And actually, just to add on one little point, kind of what you were saying, Sir, with like this idea of layering like things that are different. I also think like composing with things that are different can give you some kind of perceptual loudness for the full track. Like one song that immediately comes to mind for me, I'll drop it in the chat as well. Is this track "Light Years Away" by Oliver? It came out probably like 4 or 5 years ago at this point. But like, take a listen to. I'll drop it in the chat. But like, take a listen afterwards. Where like there are these super narrow sounds like juxtaposed against these super wide sounds, and the wide sounds sound like the biggest, widest, like craziest things I've ever heard. But it's largely because like they're contrasted against these really narrow sounds. In addition to the track is like one of the best mixed electronic tracks in my opinion that I've heard. But yeah, like this idea of contrast is really important for getting that like perceptual loudness.
Contrast is like, we could do a call just on this in itself, because it really is the one thing that I think most people like don't identify with, because it's not like something that you just assume to be the reason that something sounds big. Like I just remember, I don't know how many people are familiar with Jason Ross. He's signed to Injuna Beats. He's just like a good friend of mine. And he also has taught some kind of, like similar type masterclass courses and things like that. And I remember he was giving his like first class, and like he was going over a project, and everyone kept asking him like, why does that one sound, like it was some synth and that like, with a ton of reverb on it, but they were like, why does that sound so huge? And he couldn't even answer it himself, because there was nothing special about like that one sound. It was literally just a patch from Silent with a little bit of reverb. And after like doing enough talking about it and enough investigation about it, we realized that the only reason that it was sounding as huge as it was is because there was no stereo information for like 30 seconds right before it finally comes in. Everything was kind of mono and sounding a little muffled. And then finally, when that came in, it's like you went from 2D to 3D. And again, it's the only reason it sounds big is because of contrast or dynamics in a sense.
Also, your master, I think, plays a pretty big role in it too. Like if you have a crap master and you're like referencing and you're like, oh, this sound just isn't big enough, it could also be because you're mastering like not well. And so it's not bringing out the fullness of your sounds as best as it can. But like we were saying, all these things, it's like you can't just pick one reason. Like there's so many things that go into that fullness sound, that like creating that big sound.
Yeah. Jordan's asking, do you guys make mixing decisions and moves while creating and writing a track, or is it more advantageous to write the entire track, get it quote unquote good enough, and then start mixing it? I'll tell you right now, there's a lot of different theories and workflows surrounding like what, when or like where to do mixing decisions. I'm sure we all have different answers, but I feel like Zach, I feel like you answered a question very similar to this yesterday. So
yeah, I actually answered the exact same question yesterday. So basically, for me personally, I mix as I go for the most part. I would say bottom line, your goal should be to make the best song possible. Like, I wouldn't have the goal be I want to engineer the best song possible. Like, that can be a goal, that can be part of your deal, but I mean, realistically, it's the song that matters the most. So as long as mixing as you go isn't getting in the way of you creating a really dope song like quickly, then feel free to do it, because it saves time. It for me, it helps with picking sounds, because like if I pick a bass sound and I process it a little bit and make it sound really, really good, maybe I don't need to go layer it with another bass sound because it already sounds really good. It's things like that where I think it's advantageous to mix as you go. But I will say though that the initial like 30 to 40 minutes of a song creation process, I hardly touch any mixing tools. Like I pretty much just focus on sound design and composition. Once I've kind of got an idea going that I like, or if I need to kind of take a break from the composition aspect and like just make some stuff sound a little better, then I'll do some engineering as I go. So I kind of feel like it's like waves for me. Like I start purely creative, then it's like a little bit of mixing, creative, and then it starts to be just like constant, like back and forth. But not everyone can work that way. I do know from like researching this that you're using like different parts of your brain for like the engineering stuff versus the creative stuff, at least in the sense of like the technical things within engineering, not the creative stuff. And so basically, like, if you're one of the people who can really comfortably switch back and forth, then like it's definitely advantageous. But if you're not, if you can only focus on creating something and then making it sound good, don't force yourself to not do that. Like, just do, switch back and forth at a more elongated pace. Like, don't worry about doing it as you go. That's just me though. I don't know if Pete and Sarek are any different.
Yeah. So I'm actually the total opposite end of the spectrum. Like, when I tried to do Zach's approach, I had a really difficult time finishing music, just because I would be like doing some mixing and then going back and doing some composition stuff, and then going back and doing more mixing. I just kind of never really finished stuff. So for me, like, when I'm producing, it's just like, as long as I can kind of see the finish line and the production and like the songwriting is there, then I'm okay with it. And, like I mentioned before, I have this like tagline. It's like, oh, I'll fix it in mixing. Or like when I send it out for feedback to people, they're like, oh, you should fix X, Y, Z. And it's like, yeah, I'm going to do it later, but I know I'm going to do it later. And then I will literally print my own projects to audio files. I like lay in my bed and like pull up some Netflix and like spend 3 hours bouncing stems. And then the next morning I'll actually start in a brand new project file and like just mix, like no composition stuff, no songwriting, nothing, no arrangement, like nothing is changing at that point. It's only the engineering decisions. And so for me, like, I completely separate both of those processes.
All right, that's good opposite answers there. Let's see, let's find another one. Darren's asking, any tips on how to EQ a whole chorus section using automation to make it pop out against the rest of the song? So it sounds like Darren's asking for like global solutions to potentially make a chorus section kind of stand out.
I would just say volume's probably your biggest friend there. Oftentimes what I'll do is, before the limiter, I'll have a utility and I'll basically automate the volume of the track that makes sense in terms of the sections of the track. So maybe it starts off, at a certain volume, and then it goes up during the chorus and then goes up even more in the drop or whatever, and then back down. And I like to do it before the limiting because I kind of like the tonality of like having a less limited, like less squashed kind of track in the more chill parts, and then it like getting like almost like filling up a cup in terms of like the fullness during the drops. That's just like what I've found that I like that sound. But you could also do this theoretically after the limiter too. You could just automate the volume of stuff afterwards, but I just find that it's more effective before the limiter for me. That's probably the biggest thing. But I mean, there's really no limit to what else you could do. I mean, I think your composition probably has a lot more to do with it if you're having problems than any mixing thing would do. Like, maybe you just aren't adding enough new layers to sounds or enough new things in like the chorus section, so it's feeling more empty. I use a word a lot more recently too called handoffs. When you go from section to section, like what are your handoffs? Like, if you mute certain instruments, like let's say you're just listening to the basses, how does it sound your basses from the verses going into the basses into the chorus? Like, is it decreasing in energy? Is it increasing in energy? Is it staying the same? And kind of analyzing each of the main sections of your song: bass, chords, melodies, vocals, percussion, and kind of listening to the handoffs. That'll really help you to like isolate where problems may be.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, is kind of like you can totally do what Darren is suggesting here. Like, you can totally like do a few micro little moves, whether it's with EQ or with volume, or maybe even like a little tiny bit of saturation. Like, you can just take a whole section and, like give it a little extra. That's completely fine. And it's something you can experiment with. But I really think that for something to pop out, or for something to kind of really kind of stand out, it boils down much more to the composition in front of you. Like, to me, it's more of like adding a string layer, or an extra layer to the synth, or background vocals, right, to like a lead vocal. Like, there's so many compositional things that add fullness that, to reach for like almost like a quick solution with something like plugin wise, I just don't think that's ever going to have as big of an effect as what the composition could do.
Yeah, and I think like just think of like other genres of music as well. Like if you're thinking of like a rock song or a hip hop song, like it's not really the engineering that make those chorus sections sound bigger. It's because there's actual, they're like playing different instruments, or there's like a big cymbal crash, or it's like, your sub bass finally comes in your hip hop track or whatever. Like that size and like that movement and the impact of like those chorus sections, it's coming almost, like the vast majority of that impact is coming just from the arrangement and the composition.
Yeah, and Jordan brings up a good point in the chat, because you could do the famous mono to stereo trick, right? Like you could automate a few of the sounds during maybe a pre-chorus or a build-up a little bit towards mono, and then hit people in the face with like a full stereo width drop. Like those little effects definitely, those types of things add icing on the cake. It's literally like, if you can get a drop sounding or a chorus sounding good without like crashes, without volume changes, without like effects and all this stuff, you've done like 90% of the work. And then if you get to go in and add in this little stuff and just polish it off with something kind of the cherry on top, to quote the oldest expression ever, that will be a really good way to kind of like finalize or polish off whatever it is you're working on.
Yeah. I think I even mentioned that in my mixing video as well, that like when I'm mixing, I like my cymbals and my effects are the last things I put in. Like I try to get things sounding good without them, and then they're just bonuses.
Yeah, it's actually Data Life talked about this in their Future Music like interview back in 2011 or something.
Say,
I was
don't
like,
make yourself sound old.
I know. I was like, I was so like, hungry and ready to learn back then, that I would take every one of those Future Music, which by the way, they had to come on a CD back then. Like they didn't upload them to YouTube. You had to actually subscribe to the to Future Music, get them on a CD, and then you would have them like to watch or whatever. And eventually I just started torrenting them, which whatever. But anyway, Data Life, like they like said this back then, and I remember taking notes like on a notebook, and like that concept really did help me, because I stopped kind of relying on things like crashes and effects to do the impact for me, and instead it was like, oh, like make your composition hit, and if it hits already, then you can get to like add that extra for whatever you want at the end of the day. Question here from Alex. So he's saying, I'm struggling with getting percussive claps and snares to really pop through the mix in the way that I want. They tend to be loud enough and I have a strong enough attack, but the full presence isn't really there. Do you have any additional tips for making percussive sounds sound full and clear, and like they're occupying their own space without adding a ton of volume or overlapping other sounds too much? Awesome question.
Sir, do you mind pasting that into the chat for me again?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So
go ahead.
I just had one. I'll give you the hacker in me's solution, and then Zach and Pete can give like a real producer's answer. I'll tell you right now, one thing that I like to do that isn't like kosher, I guess. I don't know what to say here. It's basically, if you're having trouble like getting those claps and snares to just sound like your reference tracks, what I really highly recommend doing is taking some of your reference tracks and finding some naked claps and snares, and just cut them out for the time being, and start layering those limited, like mastered, the full thing. Just take those clips or those sounds from the original songs and layer them into your song and see what happens. Like, does it solve this? Does it solve the problem? Does it like, is it a coloration issue? Is it a layering? Like, you're going to start to identify the problems because you've now taken a song that sounds commercially great, right? Like, this is a great example of what to do right. And by implementing that directly into your song, you can start to learn kind of from the pros without even actually like, talking to them. You're just taking their sounds and seeing why it's working. And then eventually you can start to create some of those sounds on your own. But I'm telling you, this is a secret little sauce here. Everyone does this. don't think that you're cheating, or you're literally taking a clap or a snare sound and layering it with your existing sounds. I'm not saying to like steal the whole track. It's literally one little sound, and it can really, I think, help quite a bit.
Yeah, I would say honestly, probably like 50% of my drum sounds and songs I've sampled from other songs, like literally just chopping them out of like extended mix intros and outros and things like that. In addition, I think like one thing that can be really valuable is like slightly off, like putting your samples in off time. So if you have like, let me just pull up like random. So if I just put in like this sample here and like this one as well, which actually came from another song, like instead of putting them like exactly on the same like spot, what you can do is actually just kind of like bump them slightly off time. So we're only talking like a few ticks, and like you don't want to actually have like audibly different transients, but like that can just add like a lot more impact, and you do that with like a few different layers. That can be really helpful. And then also just like parallel compression on like a drum group. So like when you have all like your drum sounds together, just doing a bit of parallel compression on that drum bus, it can just give you a lot of like perceptual volume without actually boosting up the volume. You can either do that like with actually like routing like to like a different compressor, or just like, I mean, I almost always use the same Double Lock Deluxe plugin from Sound Toys, and just like basically inserting it onto my like my drum group, and then just dialing in like a little bit of like crush or crunch to taste, and then putting my mix at like somewhere between like 5 and 10%. And that just adds like a huge amount of fullness. But yeah, those are probably my two pieces. Zach,
is this why your music is getting so much better lately? Because you're whoring out Sound Toys stuff lately?
You don't want to see like the processing chains of some of these tracks I'm mixing now. Just like literally like a Sound Toys tribute like project.
That's great.
Yeah, I think something Pete was showing there and talking about is like something definitely to look into, and it's that there's a lot of ways you can make individual hits, especially transient type hits, sound bigger and fuller and just kind of more unique, your own. And a lot of that has to do with just like finding a chain, like finding a combination of saturation and like maybe some like light multiband compression, or like clipping, or like a chain of things that you subtly do little moves, and it kind of gives it a bit of a more in your face tone or more unique tone. I know for me, I actually have this rack. I can like share my screen and show it. It's pretty.
I was about to say, how about we just do like like don't go crazy, Zach, but like take like 3 minutes or whatever, and just like showcase your general processing chain that you tend to kind of go.
Yeah, so for snares and claps specifically, like I have this thing. This was from the mix before, so whatever. We'll just pretend that isn't there. But I actually made this rack called Drum Designer. It's fairly simple. It's just 2 plugins. The one on the end here is just Transient Master, adding a little bit of attack to the sound, as well as obviously limiting it if I do go over. But the main juice here is I've been using Slate plugins a lot more recently, and there's this plugin called within it. It's the virtual channel. So this basically is like emulates what it sounds like to run through like a board, like an analog mixing board. So you've got all these flavors of like mixing boards. So like I like the USA one a lot, and I'm basically just driving the input a little bit and backing off the output, so like for that makeup gain, and that kind of gives your samples a little bit of an organic flavor, and a little, or more like, analog, just kind of like warm. And then this is a Hollywood tube saturator, basically, or like a tube amplifier. So this is essentially like I'm running it through another preamp that's got a little bit of drive from the saturation. So again, like a combination of those 2 things, and then a little bit of transient, like it's subtle, but let's see if this is what it's the difference. So I'll turn it off first. So like very subtle, but to me at least, it just feels a little warmer, has a little bit more punch. This sound is already pretty like good. It doesn't feel like it needs a lot, but you do something like this on like a perk loop. Maybe I'll just like, let me grab some random.
Yeah, I was gonna say, normally to hear the effects of like what these processing chains can do to drums. Like you just hear so much more of it when like there's a full drum kit involved, like cymbals and
Yeah.
percussive loops and
Okay, I'm gonna like just grab this random thing from Kashmir. It's 85, so let me just so I can loop it. So like for me, it might be hard to hear over Zoom, but like it's actually a really dope difference. Like for this loop specifically, it kind of makes it go from just being like a drum loop you'd find and whatever to something that almost feels like, okay, it's like a mastered track. Like, or it's like, you know, it could be the start of a track, or it doesn't feel like it needs anything else going on, and it just sounds great. And again, that's like running it through just some you know, some amplification and some analog warmth here. And you know, that's just one thing I could do. There's like so many other things in this chain like that I could experiment with doing. Like I could add like some saturation like from FabFilter Saturn, like there's some cool drum stuff in here. I mean, I could add like, you know, another random let's see, yeah, like another tube amplifier. Like you just find cool plugins. Maybe then top it off with like Oxford Inflator. And then like all of a sudden we've got, and let me gain match it too so that we can actually hear at the same exact volume. It's like minus 1.65. I'll make it even quieter. All right, so you can see now that it's peaking at the exact same amount, and I'll just A/B it so you can hear the difference. I mean, so like, you know, it's just random stuff. Like once you know all the tools and you've got a bunch of things that are designed to change coloration and change presence and fullness, you can just experiment with randomizing and trying out different things. And like, you know, this rack sounds pretty cool. Like this would be something I could call like, you know, like drum like beefer or something, and then like save that, and now like I can recall it, and anytime I'm like, okay, I want to make this loop is super dope and I don't want to complicate it with more stuff, I just need to make it sound better because it's not sounding big enough. I can go in and grab this rack now and just like instantly like make it sound way doper. So yeah, it's kind of a cool example of, and you could apply this to literally anything, like this process. You're just about stacking small tweaks on different tonal things to kind of create a fuller sound. It's really what you're going for.
yeah, it's great answers from both Pete and Zach. There's something about processing drum sounds that just really fun. I don't know why. It's like I feel like it's just like very rewarding, I guess. But it's these types of processing chains that definitely make a difference. Pair that with a few stolen samples, and you'll be golden. There's actually a really good question here from, pull it up, from Warren. How do you guys generally go about saturating bass, specifically with the decapitator? Do you start with presets or typically just tweak the default settings? Actually, this is not the question that I meant to ask, but so basically there's another, we'll do a two-part question. So that's kind of question number one there is, how do you generally go about saturating bass, specifically with a decapitator? And then the second part was from Brett. Any tips for making a bass track sound more present on small speakers in addition to saturation? Because that is, I think, a recurring issue, right? Like getting getting bass sounds to actually sound good on shitty systems and stuff like that. So let's kind of dive into those topics right there.
Yeah, I'd say for the first question, I do pretty much use a preset with basses. I use the beefy bass preset and I tweak that. So I use that as a starting point, and then I just will either add more top end by changing the filter, or I will add more drive or less drive, and sometimes I'll change the modes. The Decapitator is such an easy plugin with such little things that you can change that it doesn't take more than 30 seconds to try out like pretty much every possible like type of saturation, and then adjusting the mix and the tonality to taste depending on the track. So if there is a preset to start with, I'd say beefy. It's an under bass. But if not, I mean, just go through all the modes, drive it a little bit, play with the filtering and the tone knob, and that's it.
Is everybody following what Zach is talking about? I just want to make sure you guys are with us, because I don't know how familiar everybody is.
Sorry, yeah, I can bring it up. So there's literally 6 knobs. That's it, and then there's 5 buttons or 6 buttons. So these are all the different styles of saturation. To be honest, I pretty much only ever use A, E, and I mean, I guess sometimes I use these 3, but for the most part, I'm pretty much just using A or E. But sometimes I'll go and experiment, and sometimes they sound better using these other ones. But I literally will like start with beefy bass, which is just some drive on A, and they remove a little bit of the tone. They basically like filter it off. I just start with this. If it's too much and it's distorting, I'll back off the drive a little bit. Usually it's not. Usually I can like pretty much leave it. I'll play with each of these buttons to just see if it sounds better. And then I'll play with the tone knob to get if I want it to be brighter or darker. And then occasionally I will back off on the mix knob. That's another thing sometimes I'll do. But not a lot of times I'll just leave it fully up. And even just selecting the beefy bass preset half the time sounds good enough. Like it's really, the Decapitator is pretty easy to do. And then there's this punish button if you want, but...
Yeah, I think the definition of the punish button is that it adds 20 dBs of drive, I believe, on top of whatever you've got set already. So, yeah, I mean, tread lightly, but the punish button, I'm surprised how much the punish button actually sounds good, especially if you kind of overdrive it using the punish and then back off on the mix. So you can have this like overly distorted signal and then kind of mix it into taste.
I need to update my Soundtoys plugins I just saw, so... Thank you guys for having me.
I've been like waiting to I got like an email from them like 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, and I just like haven't done it yet.
Yeah, and then the second question was about, remind me of that one again, sir.
Was any tips for making a bass track sound more present?
Oh yeah. So
in addition to saturation.
Yeah, so I mean, saturating your sub is going to be huge for that. So getting that overtone or layering your sub with a high, like an octave up sub, something that like has a nice tone above that's, going to be actually heard on smaller systems, that'll help. But also like having just more presence in the mid range is probably going to help as well. So maybe when you go to master, if you go to like grab a multiband compressor to like leave a little bit more meat in the mids on your track, that way when it plays on a smaller system, like the part of the spectrum that smaller speakers are really good at representing is like that middle band, right? So like between like 400 and like 5,000, like in there, like that's where they have a lot better time. It's a lot easier. So I would just make sure to try out on your master, leaving that region a little bit more full. And then for bass, like it's definitely just the overtone of your sub. Like that's where it's going to really shine through. But to be honest, you might be hearing problems that have nothing to do with the fact that your song is this genre that you're talking about. Like if you don't hear it well if it's not translating well across every sound system, there's just too many possible reasons that's happening. I don't necessarily think it's genre dependent unless it's a sub issue and it's purely like you just lose all sub, and that's because you don't have enough low end down there and like the low mids from your sub or from whatever bass sounds you have. So I would just take a look at all of those things and you'll probably figure it out.
Yeah, and it also depends on like stylistically what type of bass lick it is. If it's short and kind of almost like a percussive type bass, one of the easiest things that you can do to get it to pop through more is to add maybe like a percussive or clicky kind of attack to the sound, and then that will like almost like perceptually create the sense that this bass is a lot more present, on these shittier, smaller speakers when in reality it's not. It has nothing to do with the bass. It's just kind of like a clickiness or a top end. But yeah, I mean, to be honest, if there is a problem with the low end of your bass not coming through on small speakers, like on a laptop or something, it's not for me so much about like what I can do to that original sound, like, using saturation to get it to like come through, so much as finding a way to incorporate another layer or something else to fill in those mid-range frequency.
Yeah, my answers to those questions are pretty similar. I mean, for the first one, I actually do basically the same thing as Zach with that same like bass preset, and then just kind of adjusting it to taste from there in a similar way. Sometimes I'll also like to put on a preamp plugin before the decapitator. So like Soundtoys Radiator or like one of the channel strip plugins from Waves, and just like basically cranking the input and reducing the output to get like some more kind of like overtones and harmonics, and then putting that into the saturation. But yeah, and then for the question, the second question, for me, it's usually layering and like putting on some layer that's like going to help it come through on the smaller speakers. So like either some sort of like percussive click kind of thing, if it makes sense with the style of bass, like Sarek mentions, actually layering a different sound, or sometimes it's just the actual like sound design of the sub. Like, maybe it's opening up if you're using like a saw wave sub, like opening up the filter a little bit to get a little bit more like mid-range character in. Sometimes I'll even like take my sub and send it into a bus with like a guitar amp, and then like high pass filter, like all the sub information out, just so there's like some more kind of like buzz through the mid-range and the top end. But yeah, I mean, I think usually it comes down to layering in that situation.
Yeah, awesome. Lots of questions here from Jamie. We'll try to jump through as many of these as we can. I don't want. We could probably talk about these questions for the rest of the time, but I don't want to do that, obviously. So Jamie's asking some low-end related questions. I feel like I tend to not have too much sub or bass in my mixes. If you have an anchored kick, is there a general decibel range in volume that the bass will typically be below the kick? Something I can use as a general guideline. So I don't want to like get too far, unless I'm completely off on this. You guys can totally challenge me, but I never paid attention too much to something like decibel ranges in relation to other sounds. I strictly relied on my ears and referencing other songs in order to kind of determine like where the bass should sit. I think over time I did notice that like my bass was always a few dBs quieter than my kick, but like beyond that, there was no guiding principle or guideline to like how I was going about setting that. Again, I don't know, Zach or Pete, if you have something different to say about that, but
yeah, I don't really. I mean, my process is more or less the same. Like one strategy that I find really helpful is basically putting a low pass filter on my master out, and like A being my track against reference tracks, to basically see like, okay, below like 125 hertz, for example, what does my kick bass relationship sound like? And oftentimes that will help inform if I need more sub or less sub. And basically just listening, like, is my kick actually still audible and coming through my sub bass in a way that's comparable to my reference tracks. But in terms of like actually kind of like a magic number for levels, like I mean, I would almost argue that there's basically like no like actual template or structure like that you could use for anything mix related, especially when it comes to gain staging. Like at the end of the day, like there's so many different variables that can make you want to turn up or turn down certain sounds, and at the end of the day, your ears are going to be the best indicator of how you should gain stage, in addition to reference tracking and basically using references to help inform what should be getting turned up and what should be getting turned down.
Yeah, plus a bass is way too dynamic of an instrument, sub. Like a kick is, you can anchor it because it's the same sample over and over and over again. So it's not supposed to be changing dynamically, but like depending on what type of sub you use, how you created it, is it an 808 that you have a sampler? Is it a serum sub? Like there's so many different things that it could be. You can't really expect to be able to anchor the peak volume of a sub in a way that makes sense with the track. You have to use your ears and make judgments based on referencing and the mix, like Pete was saying. There's just no way to just tell you exactly where it should hit.
The next question here was any tips for getting muddiness out of mixes without losing the body of your track? And one thing that I can say kind of right off the bat here is that sometimes muddiness can be caused from like a bass sound that is almost like too dynamic in its, you know how when you play a bass sound, certain notes kind of sound almost like sloppier than others. Like they just have because you're hitting different frequencies and they have like a different dynamic range and they have a different perceived volume to them. So sometimes the muddiness actually isn't just a problem of like frequency, but it's almost like inconsistency in volume in a way of the bass sound itself. So sometimes something as simple as like heavily compressing your bass sounds or heavily like manually compressing your bass sounds where like you literally EQ out certain frequencies of certain notes and only notes, right? Like automating that EQ, that like that reductive EQ, actually automating it based on the notes can be a really kind of like helpful tool to get a little muddiness and control back in your mixes. But I don't know if there's there's so many different ways to get muddiness out of the mixes. So I'll let I guess Zach or Pete.
Again, it's like these are great questions in terms of music production and like the concept of muddiness, but it's also such a broad question with so many potential like conflicts. I mean, right off the top of my head, like some of the biggest things you can do to guarantee you won't have muddiness is just simply high passing more frequently or low cutting out from every sound that doesn't need to be there, and not necessarily even cutting, but like shelving. So a really common thing I do, like let's say this track here is something that has too much like rumble or it's something, and this is causing muddiness with like one of my other sounds that I like. So I could just take like a cut here and just cut out everything, right? Like that might work on certain sounds, and things that don't have anything or between 100 and like 500 or so, this is totally fine. Like you can just cut it all out. But there's a lot of sounds that have a lot of presence between like 150 to like 500, 600 in there. They have stuff in there that you like, and if you come and cut it'll, like you said, it'll like decrease the fullness and like the cool nature of that sound. So a really easy thing to do is combine a cut like this. So maybe set this right at like the sub range, and then get a shelf like this channel 2 here. I could change this to a shelf and actually just shelf down the sub instead of actually cutting it or the low stuff. That can often really help like be a more transparent EQ move to remove kind of low end rumble than having a cut be like all the way up here. So cutting and shelving simultaneously. Sometimes I do that if I feel like it's taking away too much from the sound. That's probably like my biggest, I guess, tip that I could give right off the bat. But I mean, there's other things too. You could just like make sure you're not stacking two sounds that are occupying that region. Like make sure that whatever's hitting there is at the right volume and has been, processed in the correct way so that it's fulfilling what your ears want to hear in that part of the spectrum, so that you don't need to have other sounds there.
Yeah, and just to add kind of like two little things to that, like in addition to the shelf EQs, I think like doing your kind of notch EQs through that low mid range is really important as well. So just like going through and basically seeing like what specific frequencies aren't sounding great in that region. And if you can just reduce like, 1 to 2 frequencies, a few dBs across 20, 30 sounds in your mix, like that's gonna make a huge difference. And then the other thing as well is when it comes to like sidechaining, and I find this really helpful with like how my bass instruments are kind of like working with the rest of my instruments that are in that low mid range, is sometimes I will go and do some kind of like multi-band sidechaining where like all those other instruments or the ones that are existing in that low mid range heavily, sometimes I will sidechain the low end of those instruments like a little bit more so to a kick drum than the top end of those instruments, just to get like a little bit more reduction through that mid range. Or sometimes I'll even like sidechain a low mid instrument to a bass sound if the bass sound isn't playing consistently. So like when that bass comes in, then actually the low mid range of like that low mid sound or that like lower register sound gets reduced when that like lower when like the bass is coming in. I don't know if I explained that eloquently enough to make sense, but yeah, those are kind of like two more tips that I think can be pretty helpful.
Cool. Bunch of questions here about reverb. So let's just kind of have a little reverb time here. So, what do you typically find yourself using, or when do you typically find yourself using a send for reverb, and when do you use it as an insert?
I would say pretty much I'm using sends like 97% of the time. Like really the only time I'll ever insert a reverb plugin is like if I want a reverb sound to actually be the sound in the song, like as opposed to having another sound that has reverb on it. So if like the reverb is the actual sound, I have no interest in the dry sound, sometimes I will insert it onto the channel. Also, I'll occasionally do a trick like in a build-up where if I put a reverb plugin on a sound, I will automate the wet dry up to a certain percentage throughout the course of a build-up to get basically just more air in a build to create more tension. But pretty much almost every single use case where I have a dry sound that I want to add reverb to, I'm doing it through a send.
I would say I'm like the opposite again. I'd say maybe like 10% of the time I use sends. I just like don't put a lot of reverb on stuff in my music anymore. I just find that you don't need as much reverb as I used to do. So I would say normally like I'm just very low on my mix, like the dry wet. And sometimes I'll even like create in Ableton. I also think this is an Ableton versus Logic thing because it's so easy in Ableton to like turn anything into a send like really quickly. So if I feel like, oh, my reverb signal is muddy, I need to remove some of the low end, all I have to do, I mean, for one thing, a lot of the reverbs I use have EQs built into them. So I can literally shape the reverb even if it is directly on. And like, if I have this at like 6%, like that sounds arguably the exact same as if I had done a send. But if I really wanted to, I can in Ableton, you can group anything, turn this into the like wet signal, and then create a dry signal. And then that way, and then all I have to do is change this percentage to 100, and now this is a send. It's just on the track itself, and I use this amount to send it. So, like, I'll do this if I feel like I need to, if there's an issue with just directly putting it on, but I've just been finding more recently that I can get the sonic quality that I want still by using reverbs directly on, and I've just been experimenting with less and less reverb in my music. Like I don't really do as much like room reverb anymore. I used to do a lot of room reverb, but I've just been finding that like a lot of the mixes I'm trying to like that I'm looking up to are just a lot drier than you'd expect. And that way when there is one or two things that do have reverb, that reverb sounds really nice. I've just kind of been experimenting with that. But ultimately, I don't think it really matters as long as you're not overdoing the reverb. You just can't let things tail off and drown out and get in the way. If you put a reverb directly on something and the mix knob is too high and you're not controlling the EQ of the reverb in any way, and that sound is just like drifting off and interfering with like a vocal, for instance, then that's a bad move. It's more about just listening to what the reverb is doing and the space that the reverb is occupying, and then making sure to account for that in your mix if it's getting in the way of anything else. I think that's the main benefit of having it on a send, is it's really easy to process just the reverb signal or like mix just the reverb signal in a specific way. And that's kind of the benefit. So if as long as you're careful, you don't need to do that as much.
Yeah, putting reverb on a send has a lot. You just have a lot more control that way. You can do a lot more things with that reverb, including more like just different types of EQing moves, right? You can do saturation on the reverb. You can sidechain that reverb. You just have more control at the end of the day. But it doesn't really matter what you choose. It's more like what Zach said. It's about like using reverb itself correctly and probably fairly minimally in that sense. So second question about reverb, what frequencies do you tend to cut out of the reverb to avoid muddiness or harshness? This is definitely going to vary on, depending on what your goals are and what sounds you're using, but general rule of thumb, like you can definitely cut away most information below like 150 to 200, maybe sometimes even a little higher, depending on what sound you're working with. But like, you really don't need kind of that low end information specifically for reverb sounds. And then for harshness, I mean, this is there's a thing called the Abbey Roads reverb trick, which they just kind of cut anywhere between like 8 and 10K, and just don't include any of that top end information. It's just to smooth out the reverb and make it less harsh. So that's a very common production technique, and I wouldn't like look at this as if there's some sort of a rule of thumb. It's more about like generally like maybe cut around 150 to 200 and then see if you can cut a little bit more away from that. But no frequencies I think that like you have to avoid or anything like that. It really does depend a lot on the source sound. Another question here about reverbs. How do you find that sweet spot for reverb so you don't have too little or too much? So I guess maybe Zach, since you're super minimal use of reverb, how are you finding your sweet spots?
So I have these really dope headphones they're like Audi's headphones. I won them when I won the Autograph Remix competition. They're like crazy. Like they're like $2,500 mixing headphones that basically like emulate what a treated room sounds like with good monitors, but on your ears. So fortunately, I'm able to just very accurately hear like little details and how much is going on with something. So a lot of times I do my final mix downs on those. So those just naturally make me put less reverb on stuff because I can hear the reverb so clearly with those. But in general, like I use the same reverbs over and over again. I pretty much only use Valhalla Reverb, and I use Valhalla Room and Valhalla Vintage Verb pretty much are my main go-to. So for Vintage Verb, I've just found that like anything above like 2 seconds on decay, you really got to make sure that your mix is low, like anywhere between like 5% and like maybe upwards of like 12%. But that's usually where I've just found the best like amount is. And then if you go higher than this on decay, you want to probably have a little bit less of a mix, or like if you do more of a mix, you just want to make sure that you're using the EQ feature to not let it get to, I guess, in the way of other sounds or that same sound that continues. But this is all for like mixing reverb and getting it to sound like reverbed. If you want it to be a sound design effect, like you can obviously have things way crazier. And if you're doing a lot of stuff after the fact, like automating the volume or filtering the sound, you can, get away with more reverb. But I would say like you just want to be very wary of these three things, basically the decay, the mix, and the EQ. I guess the pre-delay if you're working with like something that is percussive. Obviously you have like colors and modes to change the tonality, but I literally very rarely mess with the damping or the modulation or any of this stuff. Sometimes I'll make the size a little smaller if I don't want it to be as like big of a room feeling, but it's basically just a combo of decay times that aren't crazy and mix values that aren't high. But every sound is different. Like certain sounds just feel like more reverbed depending on that even if it's the same exact level. That's pretty much my 2 cents.
Yeah, pull up the Valhalla Room plugin for a sec.
Oh yeah, this one too.
Yeah, just to because the way that this one is laid out, like it literally presents to you kind of like these macro level sliders, which are the ones that Zach just listed, right? It's all of these ones on the left. That's the stuff you want to mostly be playing with. All of these like early and late reflection stuff, like you can try to play around with this stuff, but you would have to read the manual to really understand like what these things are doing. And I've played around with it in the past, and it was like a minimal difference in presumable quality. So I would stick to these macro sliders: mix, pre-delay, decay, high cut, and depth.
Yeah, I mean they definitely do something. Like they will change the sound, but especially if you're not in a good room or if you're just in your bedroom, it's going to be pretty minimal what you hear, especially also if your mix values are like down here, because this is more of just like a subtlety thing. If you're starting to do reverb that's like really high levels, then this stuff becomes much more apparent, and you can look into it and try things out. But yeah, like I said, I'm not using that much reverb anymore in my music. Like it's not like every single sound I put a reverb on. Like I'll have one or two lead sounds or like, drum sounds with a reverb, and then pretty much like, basses are pretty dry. Like chords and stuff are dry. Like it really depends. I think vocals, because I've been doing a lot of vocal based track, that's like the one instrument I do use a send for my vocals, only because I do a lot of processing and mixing of the reverb on the vocal specifically, just because the vocal's so constant, the reverb kind of can get out of hand, and that's about it. Like for the most part, everything else is just subtle.
And obviously bear in mind that Zach's making like, electronic pop type of music, where I think that probably, pop music specifically is probably one of the least reverb use cases.
Yeah, it's super dry, because that's how you get crazy loud, clean mixes, is when you don't have a lot of reverb. Like the first thing reverb does to a sound is make it feel blurred and kind of like more like subtle. So if you want something super crisp and clean and like a really tight, powerful mix like that in a pop sense, you don't want a lot of reverb at all. Like if anything, you want very little reverb.
Yeah, and I think like less is more when it comes to reverb. And like if you're asking, or if you think that sound might have too much reverb on it, my guess would be chances are it probably does. So like definitely would err on the side of less reverb than potentially too much.
Yeah, for sure. And on this theme of reverb, let's just kind of answer Sean's question here. He's asking, I know you've mentioned it before, but I can't seem to find it in all the information. But as far as reverbs go, which kind is best for what? Plates, halls, etc. I'm working on making different spaces in the mix for certain groups. So yeah, like we're already kind of over in terms of time here, but just to answer this like as briefly as possible, what you'll want to try to do, and this is just kind of like the theory that we kind of adhere to. I mean, you could obviously stray from this, but it's a pretty general rule or good rule of thumb, that there's going to be about 4 or 5 different types of reverbs. And what we do is take room reverbs for almost everything in the mix, meaning everything in the mix can have just the tiniest touch of room reverb, so that everything in the space kind of belongs together. It's the same reason that like when a band is playing in like a recording studio or like a stage somewhere, like they are actually sharing an acoustic space. Every instrument is sharing that environment. And what ends up happening in a production is like, you have the freedom to do whatever you want with different sounds. You can place one thing in an arena, you can place one thing in the Grand Canyon, one thing in a church, right? And they don't necessarily have this cohesive gel point to them. And we kind of believe that like you should try to at least incorporate the majority of your sounds into this room reverb. So tiny amounts. This is like barely audible using speakers. You might even want to use headphones when you're introducing room reverbs to sounds. And then plates are going to be for stuff that you want to push forward in your mix. And that's mostly because plates tend to be the shiniest and brightest type of reverb. A plate is literally 2 metal like pieces kind of rubbing together to create a super bright reverb. It's like a reverb from I think the 80s, and it's just we think it sounds best for stuff that you push forward in the mix. And then conversely, halls are going to be anything that you want to push kind of further back in your mix. So anything that doesn't deserve the spotlight for whatever reason, something that you want to kind of maybe bury a little bit, you can use halls for that. For chamber reverbs, they just sound good with claps and snares. So like those weird spaces, and if you got a reverb from like a stairwell or an attic or just, like strange chamber type sounds, they happen to sound good with claps and snares. And then finally, if you're looking for reverbs for like guitars and stuff or basses, spring reverbs usually sound kind of great. Most amplifiers tend to have like some form of spring reverb inside of them. So it's just something to try. You don't have to obviously adhere to that, but like generally speaking, spring reverbs and guitar type instruments are going to sound pretty good together. We've got a few questions left that we didn't get to. We're about 10 minutes over, so how many more can we do here? Let's see if we can do you guys want to try doing a rapid fire answers here where you have to answer in 20 seconds or less and we're not all allowed to comment on it?
Yeah, I'm down.
Should we just alternate?
Yeah, we'll start with you, Zach. Yeah, let's just start with you because you love multi-band compression. So Rob is asking, when do you guys reach? Actually, let me get my timer out so I can actually.
It's gonna be the fastest 20 seconds of our lives.
Yeah, this is gonna be tough. All right, I'll read the question and then hit start. So basically, when do you reach for multi-band compression?
Anytime I want to make a sound feel fuller and simultaneously adjust the tonal balance of that sound.
That was pretty good.
That was really impressive.
Do you have anything else to add to that, or is that it?
No, dude. Move along. Pete, you're up.
When is it truly appropriate to boost with EQ as opposed to carving out frequencies from other tracks? What would you use, or when would you use one technique over the other? Do you want me to read that again, or do you get it?
No, I got it. I think I always try to do reductive EQ first, and if that doesn't work, then I usually try for additive to an extent. That said, if the thing that you're doing additive EQ on is way more important for your song than the other thing it's competing against, definitely go for additive there. I think you have a lot more leeway for more important elements of your song to boost than the lesser important elements.
All right, so far Zach is winning. That was 28 seconds.
Felt long.
Poor showing. No, it was a good answer. Do I have to go?
No, you're good. We'll keep going.
Derek is asking, should we limit ourselves to a single stereo processor, i.e. don't use chorus and mid-side EQ?
No.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't even know. I guess no, they're just completely different things. So just because you're processing a stereo, the stereo signal versus like the sides versus the mids doesn't mean you can't do multiple things on the sides. Just like you can do multiple things to the mids.
And I know we're not supposed to add to this, but it's almost encouraged sometimes, I think, to add to use multiple tools to kind of manipulate and change a similar result. Like totally cool to layer saturators. Totally cool to layer different stereo tools. Totally cool to layer reverbs. It's completely cool. One for Pete. Philip's asking, any tips for processing electric guitars that have just been straight DI'd into the interface? My electric guitar recordings always end up sounding so weak that I end up deleting them. And maybe Zach, I don't know if you want to answer this.
Yeah.
Where you do a decent amount of guitar stuff.
Yeah, research awesome amplifier plugins to use. Logic is sick at this compared to Ableton. There's so many dope amps and like cabinets and stuff you can use, but there's a lot of third-party ones out there that you can get your hands on. I use one from Slate called S-Gear 2 is my main one. But like Guitar Rig is a good one. There's a lot of them.
Yeah, I love Guitar Rig. Also for non-guitar sounds. But we did a blog on a similar topic that I just dropped in the chat as well, if you want to check that out, Philip.
Jamie's asking if anyone caught Zach's answer on multiband compression.
I just said I go to grab it whenever I want to make a sound feel like bigger and simultaneously control the tonal balance of a sound, like the mids versus the highs versus the lows.
All right. I don't know if this is going to be, we'll try to do this as fast as possible, but Kevin's asking, what are a few non-technical tips you have to improve the quality, speed, and enjoyment of your workflow?
I think the most important thing is preparing to produce. And so like come up with a routine. Maybe it's through trial and error. Like for me, I take 15, 20 minutes and like go for a walk, light a candle and read something. And then I start producing, and it's night and day for my productions.
All right. I half expected Zach to jump in, and I forgot he's not allowed to. You're good at following the rules, dude. Diego is asking, hey, Sarah and Zach, let me know if this makes sense. Let's have a serum. Let's say I have a serum preset and it's quite dynamic, and I use the saturation, or I use saturation and not a compressor to lower the peaks, and raise up the RMS to gain more headroom and make more stable and mix it better. I'm not sure there's a question in there. Use the saturated. Whoops. Siri was just recording everything I just said. Yeah, Siri didn't come up with an answer.
Yeah, I don't know what the question is, but yes.
Yeah, no, I don't know if there really is a question in there. It sounds like there's a scenario where there should have been a question there at the end, because you can't like.
Yeah, I will say one thing that confused me was saturation doesn't lower peaks unless you're slamming into a saturation plugin like the Reviver, which has a built-in like clipper in it when you hit it all the way up to 0. So I don't know. Saturation just adds frequency content. It's not going to like lower the peaks of your sound.
Yeah. And Constantine is asking, when do I know that it's enough of, like, basically he's asking, is there a limit or a point at which you are like you've over mixed an instrument?
Over mixed or like over processed, do you think he means?
I kind of assume it's the same thing.
I mean, yeah, I would say, yeah, if it sounds bad, I guess you've gone too far. As long as it's sounding better and better, keep going, I guess.
Yeah, there's no like limit, definitely,
Yeah.
but there is like like diminishing returns at a certain point, where if you spend a lot of time on something, like you either need to reset and re-strategize, or just like move on from it. Like to me, it's important to kind of keep progressing and keep moving forward, and not get like caught up in one tiny little thing. So
yeah, I mean, like if you're the engineer mixing down like Coldplay's album, I guarantee he spent like weeks and weeks, if not months, on 7 or 8 songs or whatever. Whereas like if it's just you don't need to spend that much time on, like, it just depends on what your goals are and what you're trying to do. So it's
actually, I don't even think that like I feel like we all think that's the case, but like I'm pretty sure I read something somewhere where the engineer for the last Coldplay album, he like did it in like a week. Like it's
still like that's a pretty long time. Like I feel like I could mix an entire album in one day, but like it would just maybe not be as good. I feel like a week for like 10 songs, like that's like a couple songs a day.
Like a song, like maybe a song a day.
But it's also because they probably are more picky about letting their ears rest and trying it out on different systems. But they have hardware, so they have to bounce stems and things like that and run it through. But it's also like there are engineers take a while, because I have buddies who pay by the hour to get their stuff mixed and mastered, and they'll engineers will come back on a master and say they spent like 4 hours on it. And I mean, like, we don't spend that long on our masters that we do.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't varying time, but I'm just saying, the idea that you need to spend a month on a song is just not.
Yeah.
But cool. I think that's it for our rapid fire section. There was like maybe 3 or 4 like questions that we didn't quite get to, but got through most of them. Hopefully this was a fun session for you guys. The Mixmaster Flow course is obviously something that you guys have access to forever. So like, keep diving into it. I would rewatch a few, of the modules or whatever. It's not something you have to like walk away from by any means. Like, kind of keep coming back to it, and just hit us up if you ever have any questions. I feel like I'd be doing you guys a disservice if I didn't let you know that Zach came out with like a brand new course just today, like this morning. It's a brand new like start to finish course, where he's basically taking an entire project from like an empty blank DAW all the way through to finished, mastered, mixed, production. And the song that he happened to make for this course got signed to like one of the biggest YouTube channels in the world, and that's going to happen in later in September, I'm assuming. So just something to check out. And there is a 20% discount, by the way, that goes until tomorrow. So definitely something to check out if you enjoyed the Mixmaster Flow course. If not, no worries at all. Hit us up if you have any questions about anything from today's session or about that course or whatever it is that you have going on. So thanks for tuning in and hanging out with us for the past hour and a half. This was a lot of fun. And thank you, Zach, and thank you, Pete, for doing the same. It's good stuff.
Definitely.
It was a blast. Thanks, guys.
All right. Later. Peace.
Later.